I said goodbye to my mother on the station, and she said, "I've got some advice for you before you go off." And I'd never been north of Acton, where my auntie lived before that. So I said, "Oh, here comes the lecture about sex." And she said, "Well, I've got one thing to say to you: behave yourself," which was probably the best advice any mother could give. Anyway, I went off to Lanark, did my 6-week square bashing, started to become a man and a soldier, and then I was posted to the artillery training at Deep Cut on 25-pounders. Off we went with our 25-pounder around Surrey, doing map reading exercises, finishing up with a gun firing test down on Salisbury Plain, aiming and firing at cardboard tanks.
And missing?
Never hit one. So I thought, if we ever go into battle, I'm finished. It was a complete different lifestyle from being in the city of London and also amongst the bombing and the V1s and the flying bombs. Suddenly, I'm a soldier and making my bed and folding up your clothes, being called out on parade, dealing with standing orders, sample of which is you weren't allowed to change from your winter underwear and to your summer underwear until the 23rd of October. What happened was the war finished. I was told there was no need now for gunners, that I was going to be transferred to the Army Service, Royal Army Service Corps, and sent on a clerical course. The most boring couple of weeks of my life, nothing to do, and of course I'd done a lot of office training anyway, because I worked in an office in the city. Anyway, from there I was posted to a holding unit on the edge of Salisbury Plain, which was administered by the 17th 21st Lancers, which was an armoured corps company. The good thing for me was when I got there, I was made a company clerk, so I had a bed in a small corner of the company office where I had my own unit to sleep in and had a little cooker and everything there. And the first thing that happened was, being on my own, I was able to listen to the radio and to AFN, and being introduced to Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and also the orchestral work from Hollywood. And one of the programs I listened to was with Andrei Kostelanets, lovely strings and rhythmic music, and I think probably that's what instilled that sort of music into me. And then I get my posting, which, to my surprise and to my delight, was to the Military College of Science at Shrivenham at Swindon, which the first thing I thought, very nice, I'll be able to get home. I'm not posted to the Far East, because the war was still on in Java, I believe, then, and guys were being sent there. Anyway, I was able to, I thought, first thing is, weekend passes, I'll be able to get home to Sutton in Surrey. Part of the physics section, which was working then on what was top secret equipment, infrared gun sights and range finding for nighttime range finding and gun laying.
Now you did sign the Official Secrets Act, and you've just told us this.
Yes, I had to sign the Official Secrets Act, which I'm told is enforced to this day.
Yeah.
I made a good friend of George Towers, whose job in Civvy Street, before he joined up, he was a skilled draftsman at Rolls-Royce in Derby. Anyway, he was in charge of the medical room, and we got chatting, and he said, "You do a bit of music, don't you? You can read a bit." And I said, "Yes, I sing a bit and an entertainer." He said, "Well, let's get a band together." I said, "But I don't play anything, you know." He said, "Doesn't matter." He said, "We'll find something." And he had a think, and he said, "I've got a vibraphone at home. It's quite an old in the loft. You could have a go on that." I said, "Well, I know what a vibraphone is, but I've never played one or tried or anything." So he said, "Well, you could have a go." I said, "Yeah, but it's in Derby at your house." I said, "I tell you what we'll do." He said, "My boss, the medical officer, he enjoys a lunchtime drink. I'll give him a couple of large ones and get him to sign a requisition form to collect a patient from Derby Infirmary. We know this bloke in the transport department who plays drums. He can also drive an ambulance and we can go and collect it." "It'll never work," I said. So off we go to Derby at a weekend pass. We stay the night at George's house at Littleover, Derby, and we collect the vibraphone and bring it back to the Military College of Science. We get to Reading, and we're just coming into Reading, and there's a civilian speed cop on a motorbike down by Cemetery Junction. He gives us a wave and he says, "Follow me, I'll escort you through Reading." So, which he did, with us absolutely trembling. And I thought, if he looks in the back and he sees we've got a vibraphone under a blanket, we'll never see this light of day again. Anyway, we got to the other side of Reading, down on the Bath Road, and he gave us a wave and said goodbye. That's how I got my first vibraphone. One of the jobs that I picked up when I was at the Military College of Science, and because they knew I'd been in the entertainment side of my life, they made me manager of the Garrison Cinema. Anyway, one of the guests that came to lecture while I was there, who I introduced, was Alexander Fleming, who I didn't know, of course, not being in the science side of business, had just invented penicillin. So it was, as I know now, quite a big event.
Wow.
And it was very well attended. Much better than some of the films we had, I tell you.
Much better than jazz gigs as well, I'd imagine. Yeah.
Well, I started to practice the vibraphone and I learnt to play a few tunes. So we get the band together, which was myself and piano, which we couldn't have. We hadn't got a pianist at the Military College of Science, but we heard there was a very good piano player who wasn't a jazz type player at Watchfield. He wanted to join. We needed another front line, and all we could find was a Hawaiian guitar player. But he also played standards and a few jazzy tunes. And George played bass, and we've had our drummer friend from the transport department. We started the band and we called it the Jive 5. We were allowed to go out with a 3-tonner and do concerts and jazz and dances for the sergeant's mess, the officers' mess, and of course that got us out of a lot of parades. So music became very important to me, and did so right until I had my demob in 1948 and went back to being a civilian.
Record of yourself. So that one there, yeah.
Yeah, that's Jive 5, taken in a little hut at Watchfield on a gig,
Yeah.
and that's the other side of it, what the title was. Native manicure. So I decided I would take my demob and got my demob suit from somewhere at Farnborough, Ashvale, and I had a lovely suit and a trilby hat and a pair of shoes and a tie and went home. It was a bit of a transition then, getting back to civilian life, back to the civilian job in a city, because by law they had to keep your job if you joined up. So I went back to being a clerk. I went back to getting involved in local music, but now I was a vibraphone player and starting to play a bit of jazz, and I wanted to develop that side of it. And I was told there was a place in London called the Central School of Dance Music, which were training musicians in the jazz art form. I applied and was accepted, but they had no vibraphone teacher, but they said they knew a man that would teach me. And it turned out to be a lovely guy called Martin Slavin, who was the pianist for Eddie Calvert and a very good arranger and pianist, and also played vibraphone. And he did quite a lot of broadcasts. Anyway, he took me on. My next door neighbour, because it was a flat the other side of the wall, made a complaint that it was upsetting him, my practicing. And I thought I'd better get an idea of what the legal side here is. So I went to my local police station and said to the sergeant behind the counter, I said, I'm getting a complaint because of a noise that I'm creating practicing my instrument, because I think one day I might be a professional player. And the very clever sergeant said, what time do you finish practicing? So I said, well, I never play after 9:30. So he said, that's fine, carry on practicing. Yes, one of the gigs I did was at Burton's, which in Kingston, they had a jazz club above the shop. It was a nice room, and it was run by a very good saxophone player in the old-fashioned style called Norman George, who, by force of circumstance, was Susan George's father. And I was in his resident group, and of course we were lucky that we got named guest instrumentalists there, Kenny Baker and a few Vic Ash, people that I was later able to make friends with and be in their bands, which was wonderful, and Johnny Dankworth. And I was just starting and just variedly play a bit of jazz on a standard like Blue Moon, and Johnny very graciously said I could sit in with him, which I thought was wonderful. So I was able to learn from these great players, and that again instilled this desire to be a jazz player. I was starting to play a bit more and more. I got fed up with the day job. I said to my parents, I'm going to give up my job in the city, and I want to see if I can make my living playing jazz in the West End, in Soho, in jazz clubs. They of course were horrified, give up a day job. They'd had a taste a bit of show business and realised how awful it was to make a living and how difficult it was. I moved to London. I got a room in a basement flat with a drummer who I'd done some gigs in London with, and I turned pro. I joined a band called the Sax Tones, which was 5 saxes playing standard Benny Goodman and Stan Kenton stuff, and me playing the solos along with them, and also doing jazz gigs with London rhythm sections. So it was a breakthrough for me. I got my own band again, the ALAN GRAHAME Swing Tet, And I was fortunate to get people like Tubby Hayes and Vic Ash and other named soloists to come and front my quintet when I could afford them. When I left the job in the city, I tried to make enough money, but it wasn't possible then. I wasn't getting enough jazz work. So I took a job with a friend of mine who was the bass player and guitar player with my original group called the Jailbirds, and his father had a little toy making factory in Wallington in Surrey called Wally Twist. So I started working in the factory and listening, of course, to music while you work on the radio and the broadcasting bands. And I listened to the vibraphone player and I thought, he's good, that's the sort of music I like. And it turned out to be Lenny Best, who had a sort of cool jazz in the style of what I then found out later to be the modern jazz quartet, Milt Jackson. And Lenny at that time was my idol, having been the greatest fan of the older players like Lionel Hampton, Red Norvo, Carl Chader was another modern one that I liked.
Yeah.
Yes, I was very keen too on close harmony, and they were coming in very popular at the time, which was obviously the vocal groups, the one with Glenn Miller, the Modernaires, the Pied Pipers, and close harmony singing. Few friends that I had from my school days got in touch with me and said, why don't we have a vocal group? So we did. We started a 4-piece close harmony. It was, I think, a little bit before the Four Freshmen, and I made a couple of records with them. I remember we were doing things like Poinciana and other Latin-y things, which again started me with an interest in Latin music. On the local side, I was asked to do a gig at the Driftbridge Hotel at near Epsom, and the band leader that booked me was a drummer called Jack Wilkinson. He'd passed my name to his brother George, who ran summer seasons and bands on the Isle of Wight. And then he asked me to do a summer season there. I get the vibraphone on the train down to Portsmouth and the ferry over to the Isle of Wight, and George picks me up at the end of the pier in Ryde. And he says, well, it's a bit of a funny summer season because I want you to play in 2 places. And can you pretend to be me? Because I've taken on the job and I've got both jobs running at the same time. All right, but where am I based? Well, you're based at the Sandringham Hotel in Sandown, and the other job is at Wootton Holiday Camp. I start the gig at Sandringham, and it goes down well with a local trio, and it involves everything. It involves comedy songs. I'm doing the children's party at tea time, and then doing evening dancing. And in addition to doing all the local summer season hotel things, I'm going on the bus over to Wootton Creek to the holiday camp and playing George's vibraphone over there when he can't be there because he's taken a private function at another hotel in Sandown or Shanklin. So I'm splitting my life and staying with George at his house in Ashley Copse in Wootton. So it was hectic, but great fun. George is also running a big band at the Ventnor Winter Gardens. And so I'm involved in a guest with that on Sunday concerts and a big band gig if he got it. We had guest instrumentalists coming down. A very good friend of mine was Russ Shepherd, who was Matt Monroe's pianist. So he came down and stayed a week with us and did relief piano. And to my delight, an old friend of mine who I'd met in my jazz gigs in London, Alan Ganley. Alan practiced every day. on a practice pad and worked on his technique and all his rudiments on the drums, and made him one of our best session players and big band players as we know. The summer season finished. I said goodbye to George, and I was grateful that I'd survived a summer season for George Wilkinson. Went back to my previous freelance life, trying to make a living as a jazz vibraphone player, and went back to Sutton.
You don't get this on Stanley Kubrick, did you?
I never did this.
Didn't do a sit down.
8 years of live television every day, never had this problem.
Right, sit down. Go and lie down. Lie down. Ah, lie down.